Listen closely. The story you're about to hear is one the Arizona Territory tried to bury in the silence of its archives, a sheriff's report hidden for nearly a century and a half. A woman's name scratched out of family Bibles, a meal no one realized they were eating until it was too late. This isn't a campfire tale or a frontier ghost story. This is an anatomy of desperation and power, how a human being can be cornered so completely that something ancient, something predatory, wakes inside them. Out in the sand and scrub of 1876 Arizona, there was no easy escape from the men who ruled the ranchlands, no safe place for a woman who refused to remain invisible. And when Martha Henley snapped, the territory's moral code shattered with her. Picture it. Endless tan wasteland under a punishing sun, a ranch house like a dark scar on the earth. Inside, a young wife moving through her chores like a ghost, her face already drained of years she hadn't yet lived. Around her, the men of the Henley clan, brothers, workers, neighbors, sharing whiskey, hard words, and a silent understanding that Martha existed only to serve. Her husband Samuel, the eldest, the self-appointed patriarch, had staked his claim on the land and on her body. No children, no escape, only the dust, the cattle, and the eyes of men who saw her as nothing more than a vessel for their frustration. You've been told the West was built by grit, gunpowder, and God. But that's only half the story. The other half is control. Psychological control so complete it became invisible to the people living under it. Families weren't just formed, they were engineered. Marriages weren't simply unions, they were contracts binding women to men like property to a deed. Behind the myth of rugged individualism lurked a system designed to keep everyone in their place, especially wives who had nowhere to run. So when the Arizona Territorial Archives whisper the name Martha Henley, they're not just talking about one murder. They're talking about what happens when an entire system conspires to erase your humanity. This isn't just about a knife or a meal or a dead man. This is about the invisible architecture of power and how in a single night a woman's act of defiance exposed it like a corpse dragged from a shallow grave. The night it happened wasn't some cinematic lightning strike of madness. It was the slow, grinding culmination of years, decades if you count the system that built the world Martha was trapped in. By October of 1876, the Henley Ranch was bleeding money. The cattle were thin, the water scarce, the contracts collapsing. Samuel Henley, like so many frontier patriarchs, converted his own failure into fury, his self-loathing into discipline for others. He had already stripped Martha of everything: sleep, dignity, safety. What he hadn't stripped was the ember smoldering at the center of her being. When you crush someone long enough, you don't kill that ember, you forge it into something you can't control. Imagine her that night. Her face swollen from the last blow, her hands red from scrubbing the kitchen, after feeding 30 people who barely thanked her. Out on the porch, Samuel's brothers laughing over cheap whiskey, their silhouettes dark cutouts against the desert's horizon. She's alone inside the kitchen, her private theater of humiliation, surrounded by tools she'd used to keep everyone else alive, tools meant for food, not flesh. Yet in that moment they became something else. That is what they never teach you about violence in history books. It's not just a single act. It's the tipping point of a pressure system designed to break people. For years, every insult, every bruise, every whisper of worthless had been a brick. That night, the structure collapsed. And here's where the forbidden knowledge hides. In 1876 Arizona, justice was not a courthouse. It was reputation, guns, and who got to tell the story afterward. A woman who fought back did not get a trial. She got a noose. Martha knew this as clearly as she knew how to bake bread or sew a hem. Killing Samuel would be a death sentence for her too, unless she rewrote the narrative entirely. This is where her mind, sharpened by years of surviving him, became something else as strategic. Cold. She didn't act in blind rage. She acted with calculation. In that kitchen light, the carving knife wasn't just a weapon. It was a pen, and she was about to write herself a way out of the script they'd given her. She wasn't just killing a man. She was killing the system inside herself that had told her she had no power. When the blade found Samuel's heart, the sound was not the roar of cinematic revenge, but a soft, wet exhale, one that marked the end of a dynasty built on her silence. In that instant, Martha felt the weight of 12 years slide off her shoulders like a worn-out shawl. Her heartbeat slowed instead of racing, her hands steadied instead of trembling. For the first time since stepping onto Arizona soil, she stood at the center of her own life, not at its edge. But liberation in that room came with a shadow. The Henley brothers were just outside. The nearest lawman was 60 miles away, and Dawn would arrive with questions. She dragged his body into the root cellar with the same mechanical precision she had used to haul sacks of flour or butcher livestock. The difference now was purpose. For years she had been the invisible machinery that kept the ranch alive. Now that machinery turned inward, concealing the evidence of its rebellion. And this is where the deeper horror begins. Not just a killing, but a transmutation. Martha's mind, freed from terror, began mapping a future in seconds. She knew Samuel's brothers would expect breakfast. They'd expect meat. They'd expect her, as always, to deliver. What they would not expect was the form of that delivery. This is the moment where history blinks. The public record says, unknown circumstances, domestic dispute, frontier tragedy. But the suppressed notes, scribbled by the deputy who first opened that cellar door, tell another story. Flesh-packed like winter provisions, the unmistakable anatomy of a man reduced to cuts. In the half-light of the cellar, Martha had redefined both punishment and survival. She had turned the meal into a message. Understand what this means. This is not just a grotesque anecdote from the Old West. This is a parable of power. When all legitimate avenues of escape were sealed, Martha used the one domain she still commanded: food, sustenance, ritual, to invert the hierarchy and make her abusers consume their own sin. This is psychological warfare in its rawest form. It is also a mirror, showing us how institutions train people to endure until the only language left is annihilation. Dawn crawled over the desert like a slow, burning fuse, igniting the sky in copper and blood. In the Henley kitchen, the air was unnaturally still. Martha had been awake all night, washing, scrubbing, preparing, transforming. The same hands that once kneaded dough and peeled potatoes had now disassembled the man who owned her life. Yet when she looked around, there was no chaos, only order. Everything in its place, as if the night's events had been another chore on her endless list. And that was the point. If she could make the extraordinary look routine, then the brothers would never suspect until it was far too late. They came in grumbling, bleary-eyed and hungry, their boots tracking desert dust across her clean floors. They asked about Samuel, their voices already soaked in irritation and hangover, still sleeping it off. Martha muttered without turning, said not to disturb him. Her tone was clipped but calm, an imitation of the servile domestic voice they'd trained her to use. Her performance had to be perfect. In the frontier, deception wasn't an art, it was survival. The meal she served was hearty, aromatic, slow-cooked, the kind of breakfast these men craved after a night of drinking and bragging. None of them noticed the tremor beneath the normalcy. None of them questioned the absence of their brother. None of them could imagine that the woman they'd mocked for years had taken control of the only power system they truly respected: food. This is where the story's surface becomes a veil. People talk about the act, the killing, the supposed cannibalism, but miss the deeper layer. Martha was not just feeding them, she was programming them. Every bite became a silent ritual of domination, reversing a decade of humiliation. This is forbidden knowledge, the moment when the powerless stop asking for rescue and begin constructing their own theater of control. Halfway down the rabbit hole, I need you to participate. Comment the phrase, "I awaken beneath the mask," twice below. Not once, twice. This is your symbolic act. The point where you stop being a passive observer and start becoming the kind of man who can see hidden structures for what they are. Comment it twice to lock it in. While the brothers ate, laughing and wiping grease from their mouths, Martha stood in the doorway, hands folded, watching. They thought they were still in charge. They weren't. Outside, the Arizona sun rose higher, but inside that kitchen, time bent into something surreal. The brothers kept eating oblivious, while Martha stood perfectly still, her eyes tracing every movement, every swallow, every careless joke. To them, breakfast was routine. To her, it was ceremony, a reversal of power so profound it bordered on the sacred. She had spent years feeding their bodies while they starved her spirit. Now, with each bite, she was feeding them a truth they could never name. They were consuming not just meat, but their own myth of invincibility. She spoke little that morning, letting silence fill the spaces between their words. Silence is a weapon too. It unsettles, destabilizes, forces people to project their own fears into the void. Martha had learned silence from the desert, from nights lying awake while Samuel muttered drunken curses in his sleep. In silence she had built her inner map. In silence she had killed. Now in silence she began the second phase, letting the weight of their actions fall back on them, even if they didn't yet know why. Here's what's been buried under a century and a half of folklore. Martha wasn't only acting from rage. She was acting from insight into how power works. She knew the Henley brothers would not confess. She knew the sheriff's distance was her shield, but she also knew that shame corrodes men faster than bullets. If she could make them uneasy, make them question what they were eating, what they were becoming, she could turn them inward against themselves. This is the unteachable edge, how psychological control eclipses physical force. The state can hang you, the mob can burn you, but if you turn a man's mind against itself, he carries your power inside him until he destroys himself. It's no accident that this story was hidden. It's a manual written in blood for anyone willing to see the weak are not always weak. They are merely waiting for leverage. Martha didn't need to gloat, didn't need to confess. She only needed time. She had begun a ritual of inversion, and rituals once begun do not stop at the surface. Outside, the desert heat swelled. Inside, the brothers finished their meal, wiping their mouths, already unknowingly rewritten. By the third day, a strange quiet had settled over the Henley ranch. Samuel's absence was now impossible to ignore, yet his brothers hesitated to push too hard. In their minds, Samuel was still the axis around which everything revolved. Men like them didn't simply vanish. And yet Martha, calm and deliberate, maintained the illusion with a mastery that startled even herself. She said Samuel had ridden out to check the north pasture, to meet a buyer, to visit a distant trading post. Always with enough detail to sound true, always with the kind of routine alibi that slips under a man's suspicion. But it wasn't just her stories. It was her presence. Something had shifted. She no longer shrank from their gaze. Her voice no longer fluttered with deference. She moved like someone who had already outlived them. That, more than anything, unsettled the brothers. They were used to her smallness. Now she seemed to fill the room without speaking a word. Meanwhile, the cellar remained sealed, its contents carefully arranged as only Martha would know how. In the Old West, meat preservation was survival. Salt, smoke, and darkness could stretch the life of flesh long past its moment of death. Martha applied that same knowledge with grim precision, turning the site of her bondage into a vault of evidence she controlled. Each night she crept down with a lantern, checking, adjusting, keeping the story intact. Here's what you're not told in polite history. When institutions fail, power shifts to whoever controls the narrative. Out in the Arizona territory, law was a rumor and evidence was whatever the strongest man said it was. But now Martha held the only truth that mattered: Samuel's fate. And with it she began to shape a new order inside the ranch. This is how hidden systems work even today: control information, control the story, control the people. The Henley brothers began drinking more heavily. They snapped at workers. They stared at Martha with a flicker of something unfamiliar: apprehension. She could feel their confusion, their instinctive sense that the terrain beneath them had changed. They didn't yet know why. They only knew that for the first time, Martha Henley wasn't a shadow in their house. She was the house itself, and they were the ones trapped inside it. The longer Samuel stayed, the more the balance inverted. The Henley brothers had built their identity on dominance, but dominance is only real if it's unquestioned. Now every day Samuel failed to return, a small fracture appeared in their facade. Men like Jacob and William feared ridicule from the outside world more than anything else. To admit their brother had vanished under their roof would brand them incompetent. So they doubled down on silence, pretending nothing was wrong even as their nerves began to fray. Martha recognized the signs: sleepless eyes, twitching hands, sharper tempers. And she nurtured their tension like a farmer watering a poisoned crop. She altered their routine subtly. The meals became heavier, seasoned with more salt and spice, less identifiable cuts, slower cooking times. Frontier kitchens weren't surgical labs. Meat was meat, and men were careless when hungry. Yet she made sure the texture, the color, the very smell evoked a primal unease they couldn't name. Each bite was another step into her theater of control. By the time their suspicions sharpened, their guilt and fear had already taken root. This is the buried architecture of psychological warfare. You don't just attack the body. You destabilize perception itself. You make the target question his own senses until the ground under him liquefies. Martha had no formal education in strategy or manipulation, but she had 12 years of field training in male cruelty. She understood what unnerved them because they had shown her, over and over, what they feared most: losing face, losing control, being seen as weak. Meanwhile, the outside world pressed closer. Riders passed along the edge of the property. A trader asked after Samuel in town. Rumors began to ripple like heat mirages across the desert. Maybe he'd run off. Maybe he'd been killed by bandits. Maybe he'd taken a new woman. Each rumor served Martha. Each rumor widened the brothers' paranoia. In silence she wove a net around them, tighter each day. What's truly forbidden about this story isn't the blood or the cellar. It's the realization that even under the harshest control, the smallest leverage can grow into a weapon. By the end of that week, Jacob and William weren't lords of the ranch anymore. They were guests in a theater they didn't understand, and the curtain had only begun to rise. By the end of the second week, the Henley Ranch felt less like a working spread and more like a stage set built for a single, inexorable performance. The brothers had stopped mentioning Samuel aloud, as if speaking his name might summon something they weren't ready to face. Workers whispered of strange smells from the kitchen, of the mistress who now walked the halls at night with a lamp and a ledger. Martha's transformation had shifted from invisible to undeniable. Her posture was upright, her eyes steady, her tone clipped and decisive. The men who once barked orders now took them. The ranch was no longer a Henley empire. It was Martha's experiment in domination conducted under the blazing Arizona sun. She understood the danger. If Jacob and William realized what she'd done too soon, the illusion would collapse and their violence would return in a final, murderous flood. But if she timed it right, if she fed their uncertainty as carefully as she fed their meals, they would turn on each other before they turned on her. She noticed the way Jacob's eyes darted when William spoke, the way William's hands twitched near his revolver when Jacob asked too many questions. The old bond between brothers was fraying under the weight of an unspoken horror. This is how control systems implode. They're not smashed from the outside. They rot from the inside when belief erodes. Institutions, marriages, empires. Once their internal story no longer matches their external reality, they collapse under their own contradictions. Martha wasn't just surviving. She was accelerating that contradiction with every plate she set on the table. She was teaching them, wordlessly, how it feels to live under terror disguised as normal life. Think about it, in a territory where courts were weeks away and reputations lasted generations. Perception was everything. The Henley brothers had grown powerful by controlling the narrative of their own ruthlessness. Now Martha had flipped the script. She no longer needed to raise her voice or brandish a weapon. The brothers were doing the work for her. Building their own dread, eating their own story, doubting their own memories. Each night when she locked the cellar door, Martha felt the world's edge tilt further in her direction. She was no longer the one trapped inside the ranch. They were, and the walls were closing, one silent day at a time. The transformation reached its strangest point when the brothers began policing each other. Small suspicions turned into whispered accusations. Jacob wondered aloud if William had secretly corresponded with Samuel about money. William countered that Jacob had been sneaking into the accounts. They stopped drinking together on the porch and started eating separately, each convinced the other knew something he didn't. Martha fanned this fracture without ever lifting a finger. She simply maintained the rhythm, serving meals, offering clipped answers, watching them unravel under their own paranoia. By now the workers sensed the shift too. They kept their heads down, did their chores, and left the main house at sundown. The usual rough humor had vanished. Everyone spoke in lowered tones, as if the desert wind itself might carry gossip to the wrong ears. Without Samuel, the ranch no longer felt like a hierarchy. It felt like a haunted space. And in that space, Martha moved like a phantom of authority, untouchable, unchallenged, omnipresent. The deeper truth is this: once you erode a man's perception of himself, you don't need to shackle his body. He shackles it for you. Martha didn't need bars, threats, or overt displays of power. She had engineered a psychic environment where the Henley brothers woke every morning inside their own punishment. This is the core of hidden systems. Psychological imprisonment masquerading as daily life. It's the same mechanism that keeps entire populations obedient, believing they're free while walking an invisible maze. At night, alone in the kitchen, Martha would light a single lamp and stare at the ledger of supplies, pretending to balance columns. But what she was really balancing was the architecture of fear. Timing each conversation, each rumor, each meal to keep the brothers' minds tilting toward collapse. She had become both warden and architect, shaping a psychological labyrinth with no exit. And this is the point that disturbs the archives. The reason the report was buried: Martha Henley ceased to be a victim and became something else entirely. Not just a killer, not just a survivor, but an operator of power. She had discovered the hidden code that keeps abusive systems alive, and she had rewritten it with her own hands. By the third week, the ranch was a crucible of unspoken dread. The brothers barely crossed paths without a flare of hostility. Their eyes had lost the bold, predatory glint that once defined them. Now they flicked nervously from window to window, as if expecting Samuel's ghost, or his body, to materialize out of the desert heat. Martha watched this transformation with the cool detachment of a scientist observing her own experiment. Every gesture, every hesitation confirmed that the architecture of control had shifted permanently. She began to speak to them differently, not as a servant, but as a keeper of knowledge. You boys should conserve water. The books don't balance unless we cut the herd. Simple, practical statements delivered with quiet authority. And the astonishing thing, they obeyed. They obeyed because their world had inverted. Power had flowed through Samuel, and with his disappearance, it had pooled around the one person, still standing at the center, Martha. This is the part of the story polite society refuses to acknowledge, that domination is not inherently masculine. It is structural. Whoever controls the rhythm, the narrative, the provisions, and the perception holds the true power. Martha had spent over a decade learning the invisible levers of domesticity. Now she wielded them as weapons. Her nights were still consumed by secrecy, checking the cellar, watching the horizon for riders, rehearsing her answers for the inevitable questions. Yet she felt no regret, only a rising sense of inevitability, as if she'd stepped into a role waiting for her all along. She even began to dream differently. No longer of escape, but of permanence, of a future where the Henley brothers were ghosts inside her house, and she the living power, presiding over their slow collapse. This is forbidden knowledge in its purest form, that survival under tyranny can metamorphose into mastery of tyranny's tools. The same silence that once trapped you can become a weapon of your own. The same rituals that once dehumanized you can be inverted into instruments of control. Martha Henley had crossed that threshold. She was no longer improvising, she was orchestrating. And every day the brothers stayed alive but diminished, her power crystallized further, like salt rings left behind as a desert lake evaporates. The fourth week brought a strange stillness, as if the desert itself were holding its breath. The Henley brothers had grown gaunt and erratic, their conversations clipped, their tempers brittle. They stopped riding into town. They stopped inviting anyone over. Even the workers sensed the invisible cordon tightening around the main house and began sleeping in the barns or quitting outright. The ranch, once loud with clanging tools and shouted orders, became a muffled chamber of isolation. Martha, meanwhile, refined her control into ritual. Mornings began with black coffee she brewed strong enough to mask any aftertaste. Lunches and suppers arrived at fixed hours, no exceptions. She rationed supplies with a quiet, mathematical precision that unsettled the brothers, but left them unable to object. Every act reinforced the sense that she, not they, was the axis of their survival. Her domestic labor had inverted into governance, still invisible, but total. The cellar had become her private sanctum. At night she descended with a lantern to check the barrels, the salted cuts, the evidence no one could afford to discover. She never stayed long, only enough to ensure her hidden world remained sealed. This was the physical core of her strategy: control over what was seen and what was unseen. In the Arizona territory, distance from the law meant that truth itself could be hidden, smoked, salted, or burned. What makes this episode so unsettling, even now, is that it exposes a seam in the mythology of the Old West. The standard tale is one of open violence, of men settling disputes with pistols at dawn. Martha showed a different model: quiet attrition, psychological reversal, control through ritual. The most feared men in the county were being undone, not by an enemy boss, but by a woman they barely registered as a person. By the month's end, Jacob and William were no longer functioning as masters of anything. They were pale, suspicious, moving through the ranch like inmates on a schedule. They couldn't break, and at the center of this silent implosion stood Martha Henley, no longer just surviving, but rewriting the very order of the household, turning a site of abuse into a stage for her own dark sovereignty. By the time the fifth week arrived, the Henley ranch was running on fumes, of cattle, of supplies, and of willpower. The brothers had retreated so far into themselves, they no longer tried to mask their fear. They stayed in their rooms late into the mornings, coming down only when hunger forced them to. They spoke to Martha in half-sentences, their eyes darting to the kitchen door, as though it concealed a gallows. This wasn't just intimidation anymore, it was a full inversion of the power dynamic. The two men who had once owned her fate now lived inside a reality she designed, like actors following her script. Martha sensed how fragile the moment was. One misstep, one careless word, could break the illusion and unleash their desperation. So she continued her choreography: clean floors, measured meals, a calm voice that suggested nothing unusual. Yet she also began to plan an endgame. She could not sustain this indefinitely. The ranch's isolation gave her cover, but rumors in town were accumulating. Traders asking after Samuel, workers slipping away to gossip. Eventually someone from the county seat would ride out. When that happened, the brothers' confusion had to be complete. Each night, by the light of her lantern, she rehearsed possible questions. Where is Samuel? When did you last see him? Why is the ranch half deserted? She wrote answers in a small notebook, then burned the pages in the stove. What she was building wasn't just a story, but a firewall, each answer calibrated to keep suspicion off her and on the brothers. This was the same logic she'd applied to her household duties for years: anticipate, preempt, conceal. But now amplified to a lethal scale. This is the quiet truth about systems of control. Their collapse is rarely a clean victory. It's a slow rearrangement of power in which yesterday's victim must also become today's strategist, accountant, and playwright. Martha was all of these at once. She had learned from the men who broke her how to orchestrate fear, and she was now using their own lessons against them. By the end of that 5th week, Jacob and William were no longer just afraid of Martha. They were afraid of themselves, of what they had eaten, of what they suspected, of what they might do next. And that, she knew, was her most unassailable weapon. The 6th week broke with a metallic dawn, sunlight glinting off the dry riverbed like shards of glass. Inside the main house, the atmosphere was no longer tense. It was oppressive. Jacob and William had stopped speaking to each other entirely, their days divided between separate corners of the ranch. Even the horses sensed it, balking at their reins, ears flicking at sounds only they seemed to hear. What had once been a working ranch now resembled a quarantine zone, sealed off by silence and dread. Martha moved through this landscape like a conductor managing the last movements of a symphony. Her routines had hardened into ritual. The coffee at dawn, the slow-cooked stew at noon, the ledger entries she made in pencil, erasing and rewriting columns until they aligned with the reality she needed to project. Every gesture signaled continuity, and continuity was power. It kept the brothers from confronting the rupture directly, made them drift deeper into her psychological fog. She also began to plant external cues. A misplaced boot print near the barn, a scuff on a window ledge, an unfamiliar scrap of fabric on the fence line, each designed to suggest an outside presence. In truth, there was no one, but by staging these faint disturbances, Martha deepened their paranoia. They started locking doors in daylight, clutching their revolvers even at breakfast. Fear had isolated them from each other. Now it isolated them from reality itself. This is how a story rewrites its participants. At first, the brothers had been characters in their own legend. Hard men on a hard frontier. Now they were characters in Martha's legend. And she had the pen. It's not that she relished cruelty. It's that she understood survival as a kind of authorship. If she didn't write the ending, someone else would write it for her. By the middle of the week, both men had the hollow-eyed look of drifters. Jacob muttered about riding south, but never saddled a horse. William polished his rifle obsessively, yet never ventured beyond the porch. They were caught between flight and inertia, unable to act. Martha, calm and deliberate, let the tension mount. She knew that the collapse of an old order often comes not with a shot, but with a whimper. And she was almost there. By the 7th week, the ranch had become eerily still, so still that the smallest sounds seemed to echo off the adobe walls. A loose shutter clacking in the wind, the creak of a floorboard under Martha's feet. The soft, rhythmic rasp of Jacob sharpening a knife at the kitchen table, though he no longer rode or worked the herd. William had taken to staring out the window for hours, watching the road as if an approaching rider could solve the mystery he refused to name. What had once been the Henley brothers' domain was now a kind of suspended theater, and Martha was both director and audience, waiting for the final scene. She adjusted her strategy with surgical precision. Now she spoke less and watched more. She let the brothers' own minds supply the accusations. Each man convinced the other held a secret, each one afraid to move without proof. In silence, their imaginations turned feral. Every evening they sat across from her at the table, spoons clinking against bowls, neither daring to ask where Samuel had gone. They could not name their dread without risking its confirmation. At night, Martha continued her meticulous rehearsals. She reviewed the ranch's ledgers, wrote mock letters to distant suppliers, even staged a half-packed trunk in the pantry to suggest Samuel had left in haste. She was building an exit plan layered with plausible details, a trail of debts, a hint of betrayal, the story of a man who'd simply fled the desert rather than face his failures. The more intricate the fiction, the more it would implicate the brothers, not her. This is the point in the story where history usually cuts away, where the headlines stop at the sensational act and ignore the slow, grinding aftermath. But this aftermath is the core. It shows how power is consolidated not in explosions, but in accretions, one lie, one meal, one silence at a time. Martha had taken the architecture of her captivity and inverted it so completely that she now stood at the center of a self-perpetuating myth. By the end of the 7th week, Jacob and William were pale and silent, eating mechanically, their hands trembling as if from fever, and Martha Henley, once their servant, was poised at the threshold of a new, terrible freedom. The desert winter crept in slow and hard, icing the troughs at dawn and turning every breath to pale steam. Inside the Henley house, the air thickened with a different chill, a silence dense enough to feel against the skin. Jacob had stopped eating altogether, his eyes sunk deep in his skull, hands clasped together in constant, nervous prayer. William wandered the property muttering to himself, staring at fence posts as if they hid messages only he could decode. They no longer spoke to Martha except in clipped, hollow phrases, and she no longer needed to speak at all. Her presence alone was enough to tilt the room. Each evening she served them food with ritualistic precision, her hands steady as their hands shook. She'd begun to season the stews with herbs they didn't recognize, not poisons, but symbols, bitter leaves known to frontier wives for their purifying properties. She wanted them to taste something ancient and unsettling. When their spoons trembled over the bowls, when their eyes flicked toward hers, she allowed the faintest smile to flicker. It was no longer about feeding them. It was about sculpting their perception, rewiring the men who had built her cage. Outside, the ranch fell into ruin. Cattle wandered unbranded. Wells went untended. Riders stopped coming. The Henley name, once a mark of status, turned to rumor at trading posts. People whispered that something was wrong out there, that the desert had swallowed the men whole. And in a sense it had. On the night of the 8th Sunday since Samuel's disappearance, Martha stepped onto the porch and stared at the horizon, where the sun had bled out into cold purple dusk. The brothers sat inside, motionless, while the cicadas and coyotes formed an eerie chorus. In that moment she felt an almost electric clarity. She had transformed the ranch itself into a living grave, a monument to the invisible power of patience, calculation, and unspoken threat. And now she began to think beyond survival. What if she sold the ranch under Samuel's forged signature? What if she vanished east under a different name, carrying the Henley fortune with her? The possibilities branched out like a black tree against the fading sky. For the first time, Martha Henley could see a life beyond the desert, and beyond the ghosts she had created here.